Hi everyone. Today I have a new story for you. And today's story is called King Solomon and the Bee. It's a PJ Library book and it's about King Shlomo, King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. Let's see. They say that he was a very wise man. Let's find out why. King Solomon and the Bee. It's a story told by Dalia Hardorf Renberg and illustrated by Ruth Heller. King Solomon was the wisest and smartest king of his days. Not only could the king speak every language in the world, he could also talk to animals. The king lived in a big palace surrounded by a magnificent garden where beautiful flowers grew. When it was hot in the palace, King Solomon was in the habit of taking his afternoon nap under the shade of a broad-leaf fig tree in his garden. I see the big leaves of the fig tree and I see even some figs right there in the picture. That would seem like a very nice and shady and cool place. One day, while the king was sleeping under the tree, a young bee flew into the garden. It flew from one pretty flower to another, happily drinking the nectar. When it had had enough, the bee decided to rest and landed on, of all things, the king's nose. Uh-oh, that's where it decided to rest. This tickled the king. Half asleep, he raised his hand, and the hand frightened the bee, and the bee stung the king's nose. Oh, that really hurts when a bee stings you. The pain woke King Solomon up. As his nose became swollen and the pain grew worse, his rage mounted. Do you know what is rage? Rage is anger. He got really angry. "What insect dared to sting the king's nose?" he shouted. As his nose became redder and grew to be as big as a cucumber, he commanded with fury, "All bees, hornets, wasps, and flies, appear immediately before me." He called all the insects, I think, because he wanted to know which one hurt him, which one bit him, stung him. From every hive and nest, from near and far, swarms of bees, hornets, wasps, and flies flew into a panic to the king's garden. That's a lot of flying insects. They were all buzzing in confusion when King Solomon shouted, "Silence!" A hush fell upon all. Pointing to his nose, the king roared, "Who among you dared to do a thing like this to the king?" Nobody moved. Nobody buzzed. "Who among you dared to do a thing like this to the king?" Solomon repeated. Finally, a small bee flew straight toward him and said, "I am the one, my lord, my king." Before the king had time to get angry and punish the bee, it pleaded, "Oh, my lord, my king, please, please don't be angry. I am a young and foolish bee. I have not yet learned the difference between a flower and a nose, or between one nose and another, especially the nose of my lord, my king, a nose with a rose-like fragrance and a banana-like grace." Is the bee talking very nicely to the king so the king won't be mad? I think. As the bee talked, a faint smile grew on King Solomon's face. The bee gathered more courage and continued, "I have sinned, my lord, my king, and I am so sorry. Do not be angry with me. Do not punish me. Who knows? Maybe one day, my lord, my king, I will be able to repay you with a favor." King Solomon burst out laughing. You? A little creature like you, a tiny little bee, will repay the king? He laughed so much that he could not talk. He just motioned to the little bee and all the other insects to fly away. He said, go away, you're so funny. When the king stopped laughing, his servant put ointment, like a cream, on his nose, and soon the pain and the swelling went away. Before long, the king forgot all about the bee. One day, the Queen of Sheba came to the palace to visit King Solomon. She's a queen from another country, from another nation. She had heard how smart the king was, and in order to test him, she had brought with her all sorts of difficult riddles, puzzles, and questions. One by one, she presented them to the king, and one by one, he solved them. Right? King Solomon was very wise, and so he did answer all her questions and solved all her puzzles and her riddles. The time came for the last test. The queen brought to the throne room several of her young maidens. Each of them held a bouquet of beautiful flowers. Before you, O King Solomon, in the hands of the maidens are bouquets of flowers. Only one of them is made up of real flowers. The rest of the flowers are made by human hands. Do, O king, tell me which is which. Oh, so the king had to figure out which of these bouquets of flowers are the real ones. Sometimes people make flowers and they look so real that you can't tell that they're not real. The man-made flowers look so perfect, so much like the flowers of the fields and gardens, that the king could not tell them apart. He looked and looked some more, and still he could not tell them apart. The king was ready to give up when he heard a little faint buzz outside the window. He was the only one who heard it. And when the king saw the little bee, his eyes lit up. "Oh, open the window," he told the servant. "Be quick." What do you think he's gonna, why is he so quick to welcome the bee, to open the window for the bee? What do you think? The window was opened without anybody else noticing. The bee flew in and headed straight for one bouquet. The king smiled and pointed at the bouquet where the bee settled. "That bouquet is the one with the real flowers," he exclaimed, to the amazement of the Queen of Sheba and her maidens. So what did the bee do? The bee because it's an insect that drinks the nectar from the flowers, it knew which bouquet was real, right? And so King Solomon used the bee to help figure out the right bouquet. And that is how the little bee repaid the king. Was the bee able to help the king? Yes, the bee was indeed, even though she was so little and the king thought that she could never do any favor for him, the bee was able to help the king. Now this story reminds me about another story that I've read that is called The Lion and the Mouse. And it is about another king, the king of the jungle, which is the lion, and a little mouse. And the story of the king and the mouse reminds me of this story because in that story, the mouse also tells the lion that he might help him one day. If you can look for that story, read it and see if you find anything that is the same as in this story. And then maybe we can read it another time. Have a great day, everybody.